This is Claytee White. Today is Monday, September 28th, 2003, and I'm sitting here talking with Mr. Darrell Luce. Good morning, Mr. Luce.
Good morning.
Would you give me your full name, please?
Yes, I'm Darrell Dunkle Luce, and I lived here in Las Vegas since 1932 when my family came down from Reno. My mother and father both were graduates of UNR, and my father graduated with a degree in electrical engineering, and he pursued this occupation for about 14 years and then came back to the Reno area looking for a job. He found out that there was a small electrical appliance store here in Las Vegas that was for sale. So he, my mother, and my sister and I, we all came down to Las Vegas, and he bought out the store in partnership with a man who was already working in the store by the name of Mr. Les Goodfellow. So the store was named Luce and Goodfellow, and the first location was on Fremont Street, downtown Las Vegas, between what today is called Las Vegas Boulevard. In those days it was 5th Street, between 5th and 6th Street, and it was on the north side of the street. And beyond that, there was very little. After you went past 6th Street, there was very little in the way of business, except down perhaps along about 10th Street in that area and 11th Street. There were a couple of small, what in those days they called auto courts, which was today's motel, little tiny motels. And then the street continued, but wasn't paved, and it went on out. If you followed that street, Fremont, and followed it on out, it would become the Boulder Highway, and that would take you to Boulder City and, of course, to the Boulder Dam construction area.
Where did your family live?
When we first came to Las Vegas, we lived on South 4th Street in the 500 block in some duplexes that were owned by a railroad worker. He had built them as rentals, and he had them there, and they were quite new. That area on 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Street was that primarily occupied by railroad workers. But these duplexes were quite new, and we lived there. And I think an interesting thing, this was in 1932, that we did not have any air conditioning whatsoever, and the water heating system was a solar system, and it was very primitive. The man put a water tank on the roof of each duplex and put glass around, encased the water heater with glass, and depended strictly on the sun to heat the tank, and that was your source of hot water.
So in the morning, did you have hot water?
Not much. So you heated, if you wanted some real good hot water, you had to heat it on the stove. And we had, my recollection was that we had propane gas stoves. The first cooling at all, my father being in that type of business, he was able to get one of the first primitive forms of air conditioning, and it was no more than something that looked like a large bird cage, and it had felt strips in it and a little propeller with a little pump, and you set an electric fan behind it, and the little pump would go around and squirt water up on the felt pads, and then the fan would blow across the felt pads, and that was the original type of evaporative cooling. Later on, in the late 30s and up into the 40s, many of the homes were cooled by what are called, there's several names for them, swamp coolers, desert coolers, evaporative coolers, much larger, but worked on the same principle on a much larger scale. And they would be mounted on the outside of the house in a window or up on the roof and come down through ductwork. into the house, and that didn't come in though until the late 30s or early 40s, and it.
That's great. Tell me about that heating system for water, the hot water system. Did other places have that as well?
I don't really think so. As far as I know, I never saw another system. It was an idea that this owner had, and it worked fairly well. Of course, in the summertime, when it's so hot, the water got very hot. In the middle of the day, you'd have wonderful hot water.
That's great. Do you remember his name?
Yes, his name, I don't remember his first name. His last name was Randall.
Good, thank you. Now, earlier you said you had a sister. Give me your sister's name.
Okay, her name is Jean. Of course, it was Luce, and she's now, her last name is Vetter, V-E-T-T-E-R. She went away to college in the 40s, and after graduating from college, she went on and became a school teacher for a little while, a few years, and then got married. But she's never come back to live in Las Vegas since really like about 1948.
Where did she go to school?
She went to a college called Principia College, which is in Illinois, right across the river from St. Louis.
Okay, I want to ask one more question about that house. Tell me about the bathroom facilities in the early 30s when you got here.
Well, it had the normal facilities. Of course, it was small, but they had the normal facilities that like we have now. It had a bathtub with a shower and a commode, and so it was, as I say, these places were quite new when we moved in. I don't know that we were the first people, but we might have been the first people to live in them.
Now, what about the railroad cottages? Were you near those?
Yes, they were mostly up on 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Street. And they were, in those days, they were restricted. You had to work for the railroad in order to live in them. And of course, my dad didn't work for the railroad, so we couldn't live in one of those.
When you told me about your sister's education, I find that really interesting. So I want to go back and talk about the women in the family. If you would, please, tell me about your mother and your grandmother and their schooling.
Okay, well, they both went to the University of Nevada in Reno. My grandmother went there before it was called UNR. I think it had some name, including in the wording of a seminary. Of course, it was tiny, and I don't know the years. I'm kind of a little fuzzy on that, but I know my mother went to UNR. It would have been along about World War I time. When she went there, and she got a degree in education, and she had a very interesting teaching experience because she taught the first year in the town of Tonopah, Nevada, which had been around the turn of the century had been a fairly large town because mining was very active. By the time she got there, the mining had tapered off dramatically, but she taught in the school there, and I think the most interesting thing is she had lived there as a young girl. She had lived there for just several years while she was growing up, and so she went back to, I'd say, her hometown of Tonopah as a school teacher. Then she taught the second year in Hawaii on the island of Maui. And this is, of course, Maui had very, very few people. I think they only had one high school on the whole island, and she taught in that high school. And then she traveled while she was in Hawaii. She traveled, which was unusual for a young lady. She traveled and went as far away as China. And then the third year, she went back to Reno and taught in Reno High School. And that's when she came back there is really when she met my father, because he was actually a little bit older, but he was in World War I, and so his education had been put on hold while he was in the Army.
So now tell me how the family felt about your mother doing all of that traveling.
Well, I haven't mentioned she went to Europe also during
my.
one of her summers. I can't really be honest with you. I can't tell you, but obviously they allowed her to do it, and she would go with another young lady. She didn't do it totally alone. She'd get someone to go with her, but she was very adventuresome for a young lady. She was probably like 21 or something like that to travel. And of course, in those days, you traveled by ship, so it took you a long time to get. Like if you're going to China, of course, she was about halfway to China in Hawaii, but to go to Europe in those days, I think probably it would take about a week to go from New York to Europe because the steamships weren't that as fast as they are now. So she was very adventuresome.
That's wonderful. Now give me her name again. I don't think we put it on tape.
Okay, her name is Gladys Dunkle Luce.
And now her mother.
Her mother is Lola Toms Dunkle.
And tell me about her education.
Well, she went, as I say, she went to the university in Reno. I don't know much other than that, other than her family came to the Reno area in the 1870s. And her father's job, or his business, he ran a stagecoach that ran from Susanville, California, which is up in the mountains, about 100 miles from Reno. And he ran the stagecoach back and forth, and he had some experiences, literally, where they had robbers that would come and rob the stagecoach. And his most interesting experience was that in one of these robberies, and I don't think they happen too often, but in one of the robberies, he wounded one of the robbers, and he put the robber in the stagecoach and took him back to Reno for medical attention. So that's one of our old family stories.
Wonderful.
And my grandfather on that side, Dan Dunkle, I don't know much about him except that his family, again, came to Nevada in the 1870s, and his father was a state legislator in the very early days, and I don't know his father's first name. But he himself, as a young man, he worked for Wells Fargo, and he worked on a train, and he was the guard for the gold that was being sent from the mines in Tonopah. It was sent to Reno to be shipped on somewhere else, probably to San Francisco from there. But he would ride the train as an armed guard, but he never had any robbers.
That's good.
And then later on, he and my grandmother moved to a very small mining town that was somewhere near Tonopah. It's not in existence at all anymore, a place called Blair, where they ran a very small hotel for the miners. And then later on they moved back to Reno, where Grandpa Dunkle was a county treasurer in Washoe County for about 30 years. And he then retired from that job.
Thank you for that. In the 30s, when you first arrived, and you're a very small boy, so I don't expect you to remember, but tell me some of the stories that you heard about the Hoover Dam, the Boulder Dam.
Well, I can tell you some first-hand things, because by the time we got here, I was 5, and my father had this electrical appliance business here, but also he had let's say a small auxiliary store in Boulder City. And of course, in those days there weren't too many families in Boulder City, so he had just like a little tiny store, probably not too much bigger than this room.
And this room is about what size?
Oh, this is probably like about 15 by 12 or something like that.
Okay.
It's a little bigger, but behind it were living quarters. So he hired one of the guards for the construction site and his wife. They lived in this little tiny living quarters behind the store, and they ran the store for him. But what he was selling mostly, because there weren't many married people and there weren't hardly any homes. There were a few homes in Boulder City, but most of the men lived in barracks, like Army barracks. And so he would sell mainly things like irons to iron clothes with, and radios were very popular. But you had to have a very good radio, because we did not have any radio stations in southern Nevada whatsoever. And you had to listen, the only radio station you could listen to would be like one in Salt Lake City, in Los Angeles, or in Phoenix. So he sold radios and irons and a few toasters. But because of this, he would go out to the Boulder City store almost weekly, and usually it would be on Sunday when the Las Vegas store was closed, but he would usually take us 2 kids with him. And in order to even get into Boulder City in those days, you had to have some kind of reason to be there, and you had to have identification. And so the guards would stop you on the road, and if you didn't, let's say, pass their test, you didn't get in. So, but he had the proper credentials to get in. Once you got in to Boulder City, then you were free to drive down the construction road to the dam site where they were actually doing the construction. So part of our Sunday treat to go to Boulder City was to go to Boulder City. He would transact his business and take some more irons and toasters and radios in the car, and then we would drive on down to the dam site to see what was going on down there. So we were able to see, of course they worked 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, except I think they didn't work on Christmas, was the only day they didn't work on. So there was always something going on, and we would see the workers doing various things, but I think the most impressive thing was the cableway that they had constructed so they could pick things up off from the road going down to the construction site. They could pick things up, very large things, as big as a boxcar. They could pick it up off the railroad track with this cableway and take it out over the canyon and then lower it down to the level that they wanted to. And that's the way they took the cement that was the main construction material. The dam, of course, was cement. And then they had these huge containers that they could take out on this cableway and drop down to the men, and then the men had a way of opening up this big container, and then they would use vibrators and things to make it solid, and they had pipes running through the cement in order to cool it, because they had to have a huge refrigeration plant, they had to have a huge cement plant, they had to have a huge gravel plant, they had a plant to construct a huge pipe that they used. It was big enough to drive a car through, and these were all located near the dam site, all these things. And the reason for the cold water was that it made the cement cure faster, because if they hadn't had that, it would literally taken years for the cement to cure. So they put the pipes in and ran cold water through them from the refrigeration plant that was up above on the side of the mountain.
Did you get to know any of the workers?
Well, other than I mentioned the guard that ran my dad's little store, they were busy people, and they had an observation point where you could pull your car and you could watch pretty much the activity. My father, I'm sure, got to know some of them more as customers in the store, because they would still come into Las Vegas. They were allowed to come into Vegas, and they were not allowed to drink on the job, alcoholic beverages at all, and so there were not any available inside a fence And the closest place they could go to get, I think in those days maybe just beer, but anyway, is Railroad Pass, which was outside the fence. And Railroad Pass still exists today. It's, of course, has been modernized. It's going to Boulder City. It's called the Railroad Pass Casino, but in those days it was very tiny, and it was a casino and a bar and a restaurant. But most of the people, they ran buses. The workers, if they really wanted to have a big holiday or a weekend, they would come into Las Vegas. So I know for sure that my dad knew some of the workers that way from the store. Before I leave the dam, though, I'd like to tell you one of our family stories. As they got fairly far along in construction, and they were getting fairly close to letting the water come in, they built coffer dams upstream to keep the water away from the dam. They built diversion tunnels so that the water from the Colorado was diverted around the construction area through the walls of the canyon. So that was what was going on during construction. But as construction got pretty close to being finished, they were going to destroy the coffer dams and let the water actually come up against the dam for the first time. And so we were able to drive down into the area on the upstream side of the dam and go down, get out of the car and walk over and touch the dam at a point that is now approximately 300 feet underwater. So we thought that was pretty thrilling.
Oh, that was wonderful. Tell me about the women that you saw in that area. The person that worked for your father was married man.
Uh-huh.
Now, were there a lot of women around?
No, the great majority of the workers either were bachelors or didn't have their wives. As I say, there are very few women in Boulder City. Most of them were wives of like a foreman or a superintendent or some sort of an executive. The great majority of them did not have wives. They lived in barracks, like Army barracks. And as time went by, they began to later on build schools and hospital and things like that.
Do you remember meeting any of the children?
No, I don't. No.
Now, do you remember any people working there other than white Americans?
They had very few African Americans. In fact, the early days of construction, there weren't any at all. And then someone brought that up as a problem, and they did hire, I think, less than 100. And I don't remember the exact workforce, but it was several thousand workers. So they did hire a few maybe after the first year or two.
Now, I also read the other day that some of the people working on the dam were Indians, and they did some of the high work.
What maybe they call high scalers.
High scalers, that's correct.
I've only ever known one man that actually did that work, and I met him many years afterwards, and he wasn't Indian. If you're speaking about an American Indian, yeah. Mm-hmm. But that work was pretty well finished by the time, that was very, let's say, some of the early work when they were doing that, and we didn't actually see any of that going on. This man went on to become a very rich man, and he wound up owning a very large percentage of the Golden Nugget Casino downtown.
No, what was his name?
His name was Buck Blaine.
Okay, good, thank you. Tell me the type of ID they expected you to have to get into Boulder City.
I don't recall, except my dad had to show something, and wasn't any problem once he showed him the ID. I don't really know what it was. I don't recall.
Other than your father's store, were there others?
Yes, a few. There were a few. The building that he was in, that his store was in, he just rented it, and there were a few other stores. The only one I can recall, and it was much larger than my dad's store. There was a grocery store there, but I don't remember what other stores there were.
Do you remember, since men lived in dormitories, do you remember how they were fed?
They had mess halls, just like the Army.
Okay. Okay. Now, some of the men went into Las Vegas for recreation. Do you remember any talk of Block 16?
Sure, of course, I was not allowed to go near that. But there were, Block 16 was where they had houses of prostitution, and some of them were pretty fancy. The fanciest one, I've seen pictures of it, I didn't go over there, but it's called the Arizona Club, and they had very fancy mahogany and crystal, and it was, for Las Vegas in those days, it was a fancy building. And there was also some, during the Prohibition era, which Block 15 was where a lot of the speakeasies were, which was adjacent to 16. And they didn't enforce the Prohibition laws very stringently in Las Vegas, I can assure you that. And there is a story, though, and I don't know if you want me to go into this.
Yes, please.
Okay, there was a story that they called them the probies, which were the officers or Prohibition officers. And they didn't live in Las Vegas, but they would occasionally come to Las Vegas, and they came on the train, which of course is the only way they could get here. And most of the time when they would be coming, someone would telegraph ahead and tell them that this speakeasy guys would tell them to hide all their stuff and close the doors. But one time they set up like what you'd call a scam, and they sent an agent up here, and he set up a speakeasy of his own, and then he invited the people who were actually making the stuff, and some of it was coming from as far away as like Montana and Wyoming. They were, bringing it in, but he invited these people to come to his speakeasy, and he'd buy it. So he then had direct evidence of where it was coming from, and then they arrested a bunch of people. But that was in, I guess, probably would have been in the, I've kind of forgotten when Prohibition was, but it was in the early 30s, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Now, tell me, have you talked about Block 15 and Block 16.
Uh-huh.
Did you ever hear about Block 17?
Well, I think you're probably referring to the block where the first blacks lived. They lived in that area, and there were, up until about 1940, I would say there were less than probably 100 black people that lived in Las Vegas. And then when Henderson was built and the basic magnesium plant was built, they brought in quite a few black workers from the South, because it was during World War II, workers were short, plus the jobs out there were very, somewhat hazardous. And they worked hard under very, let's say, hazardous and hot conditions. So when that happened, then they built one little area out around the plant where blacks could live, but it wasn't near big enough. I can't remember the name of it, but...
Was it Carver Park?
That sounds right.
Okay.
And then they built some other homes for white people. Mm-hmm. But at that point, what was called originally the McWilliams subdivision, and then it became called the West Side. And that became, in the 40s, that became predominantly black. It wasn't totally, because this was when I was in high school. And I had a few white friends that still lived on the West Side in the 40s, but it was predominantly black. But and that's, as years went on, I think it became more almost totally black. And that's the area where the streets are named after the presidents, like, Wilson, Washington, and Jefferson. And that's where it was originally, though, was McWilliams track.
Okay.
Okay.
Good, thank you for that. So, did you ever go to the west side before blacks became the major population over there?
Both before and after, because we had a lot of customers over there from our store, and I worked in the store with my father after I got back from the Army, so I went to the west side almost every day.
Tell me what it looked like before BMI and then after.
Well, before BMI, it was very tiny. There weren't many people over there, and the homes were very humble. They did have a small school that was put in over there, and I really don't have a good handle on when it went in, but it was on about D and D.
Okay, go ahead.
I'd say before the 40s, there probably would have only been like maybe between 20 and 50 homes over there. It was pretty small. And in the 40s, it began to grow and continued to grow. But I remember the school being over there, like I say, a small school with I think just 3 grades. Wasn't much over there in the way of business. There was one little tiny store right as you go down Bonanza there, as you come up out of the Underpass. In fact, there were 2 stores. One was a liquor store and the other was a small grocery store. And one was called Gilbert's Liquor Store and the other was a grocery store called Snyder's, I think. So there were 2 little tiny stores, and then I think there was one little tiny cafe somewhere over there. I'm pretty sure it was over there before the 40s. I know it was there after 40s.
The Underpass. Can you tell me a little bit about the Underpass?
Well, it was the only underpass in town, and I'm not sure when it was built, but I have no recollection of it never being there. So I suspect it was built maybe in the early 30s, and all the other crossings to cross the railroad track would be just, I think they call them grade crossings, where there's no underpass, and if there was a train coming, of course you had signals, lights flashing, but you would have to stop. And I'm trying to think, in the old days, I think there was only 2 places to cross the tracks. One was Bonanza, and the other was Charleston. Those were the only 2 places you could cross the tracks. Yeah, I'm sure of that, now that I'm thinking about it. Later on, there was one at Sahara, but that came later. In those days, Sahara was called San Francisco Street, in the early days. That would have been, though, up to in about the 40s or maybe even early 50s before it was cut through, and it became about the same time, I think they renamed it, and it was cut through so you could go out to what would have been West Sahara.
Tell me, when we started, we talked about your family's education, but tell me about your education.
Well, I started the school right down the street from where we lived. The schools, all the schools except the high school, were located in a 2-block area between 4th and 5th, which in those days Las Vegas Boulevard was 5th Street, and it was called the 5th Street Grammar School. And they did have separate buildings. I've forgotten how many, but I'd say probably about 4 buildings for the different grades. But they had, along about maybe 34, 35, they had a severe fire in the school. And about half of the school burned down. And so what they had to do, the older students that were in like the 7th and 8th grade, they went over to the high school. and that did away with the junior high school concept for a long, long time. We didn't have any junior high schools in Las Vegas. And the rest of the kids that stayed there, in the buildings that didn't burn, of course they were still usable, but about half the kids had to go to school in tents. They built large tents with, you know, wooden floors and wooden sides, but canvas tops, and until they could build some new school buildings. And I'm not sure exactly, but I'm sure it was along like maybe 34, 35 that happened. Then after going to school in at the 5th Street Grammar School, then my first year in high school, my parents sent me to a military academy in California, and I went to school there 1 year, and this was early World War II times, and of course it was near San Diego, and so there was a beehive of military activity, and they had blackouts every night, and you couldn't show any lights at night, and they had barrage balloons over the factories in San Diego, and all the factories were camouflaged in that they had like fake houses built on top of the factory buildings, so if a bomber came over, they couldn't spot the factories. They would look like a housing development. And of course there were servicemen all over the place in San Diego, because it was, Army, Navy, Marines, and during the daytime they would practice firing out over the ocean. This school was quite close to the ocean. It was only about a mile from the ocean, and they would practice firing at targets out over the ocean during the daytime. So you very much felt, that there was a war going on.
Wow.
Then I came back from there after my that was the 9th grade. I came back and went to Las Vegas High School for the next 3 years, and graduated in 1946. Then went up to UNR in Reno, and to put it bluntly, I was not a good student. I was lazy, and real lazy. Yeah. So my college career was not real successful. I went to college for about 2.5 years and wasn't doing very well, and I was wasting my time and my father's money. So I came back to work for my father in his store. By this time the store had grown. It was no longer on Fremont Street. It was on what's today called Casino Center. The store would be today, if you went in the lobby of the Golden Nugget Hotel, that's where my father's store would have been. So, but anyway, I came back to work for him. Then the Korean War came along, and I was drafted into the Army, and I was really, because of the military school and because I'd taken ROTC in high school here, I was very interested in the military, so I wasn't at all sad. I really wanted to go into the Army. So I went in the Army, and I spent 3 years in the Army during the Korean. This was during the Korean War days. And I was able to go to officers candidate school, and I graduated #1 in my class and went on to be an artillery officer. And probably the most outstanding thing about that experience was that I was selected with about 100 other men to test a new weapon that the Army had. And for the first time, the Army was going to get something that would deliver an atomic round or atomic bomb. So I was a radar officer, and we were able, with radar sets that were quite portable, we were able to track projectiles that came out of a cannon and tell pretty much where they were. We had a very, very crude computer. I'm not sure they even called it a computer, but it was a big machine that would actually print out the trajectory of these artillery rounds. So that was my job. I had a crew, and we operated the radar set, but we were sent out here to the Nevada test site. So that was the only place that they could fire it with atomic ammunition. We practiced with regular high explosive ammunition down in Oklahoma for about 3 or 4 months before we came out here. But then we came out here, about 100 of us, and they had this huge cannon that would fire a projectile up to about 20 miles. And so I was sent home, which was pretty neat. I was able to, most of the time, sleep in the bed that I grew up in. Then I'd have to get up real early in the morning and drive to the test site, just like the workers out there would have to do. This would have been in 1953.
Tell me about the test site at that time.
Well, it was very, very active, and they were testing above ground. It was all atmospheric testing. And prior to my going there, they had the first test with troops. They actually, I don't know the exact number, but they brought troops in there and put them in open trenches within about 12 miles of what's called ground zero. And then they set off an atomic device. And in those days also, they had all sorts of equipment. And what I mean by that airplanes, trains, boats, buses, houses, that they would put closer than the 12 miles to the target area, or ground zero, to check the effect that these weapons would have on these different items. But anyway, prior to my going there, they had troops out there. And when we got there, I was only there about 45 days. But during that 45 days, we had 3 tests. We had the one including the cannon, which is the one I was really sent out to do. We had one that was dropped out of an airplane, and the third one was what they call a tower shot, which is where they build a tall tower that would be about 200 feet off the ground, and they would put the atomic device up on top of the tower and then kick it off or trigger it. I observed, of course, the shot that I was working on and the 2 other shots while I was there, and security was real tight. When they were going to have a shot, they would completely close the place up. No one could come out or go in.
So the workers?
That's correct.
Had to stay at home?
No, either stay at home, or if they were out there, they had to stay in the test site. And they had, of course, barracks again for them, and they weren't sleeping in the desert.
So men slept at the test site?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Now, explain to me why did they have those troops in the trenches? I don't understand.
They wanted to see if they were going to survive. That's putting it bluntly. They wanted to see if they, of course, they were, by that time, they were pretty smart, smart in that they'd learned quite a few things about atomic weapons. And they were constantly trying to reduce the radiation level, because if you're going to use it as a weapon, then you say dropped it on an enemy or shot one, like in the case we were shooting things out of a cannon, you didn't want the radiation level to be so high that you couldn't go in and occupy that area with your own friendly troops. So they were trying to reduce the radiation level. And of course there's heat and blast and fire in addition to radiation. Of course there's a tremendous amount of energy is expended when one of these devices would go off. But that's why they put the men out there. They just wanted to see what was going to happen to them. But they were pretty sure before they put them there that nothing was going to happen to them. But they wanted to prove it. It was also, in those days, we were involved in a Cold War with Russia, and they wanted to impress Russia. They didn't want Russia to know any of the details whatsoever, how they were doing it. But they wanted Russia to know we were testing atomic weapons. They wanted them to know that.
Did the troops know why they were there?
Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Now, are there any other interesting things that you can tell me about the test site?
Well, other than what I think I've told you, and later on, of course, they signed a treaty, probably sometime in the 80s. They signed a treaty with Russia to stop atmospheric testing, and of course Russia stopped doing it and we stopped doing it because they were experiencing fallout, both in the United States and in Russia. And some of the fallout even drifted clear from Russia up into Alaska.
Did you ever hear about the fallout from here going to Utah?
Yes, but it was after the fact. But I can say this, of course, all the tests were conducted under the safety requirements of the Atomic Energy Commission. And they took as many steps as possible to cut down on the fallout, and they would not kick off a test if the winds were real strong going to the east. Of course, the winds are prevalent in the United States going from west to east. So, but they had to have certain conditions, and they would, like if they had a test and they got up in the morning, the tests were always very early in the morning. So just around dawn or shortly thereafter dawn, if the wind conditions weren't right, they would cancel the test.
Two other questions. I want to know how you felt about that, especially with your military background.
Well, I felt I was doing a job that needed to be doing, and it was a very interesting job because we were doing something that had never been done before. We were, let's say, plowing new fields. So I felt interested, and the work was interesting, and I felt I was, of course, doing my duty. But the long overall reason for it was to keep the Russians in check. This weapon that I spoke about was deployed approximately a year later in Europe, and they had more than one that was deployed in Europe too, and they let the Russians know that they had these weapons in Europe because at that time the Russians outnumbered the Allied troops tremendously in Europe. More tanks, more men. They could have overrun our men, but with these atomic cannons over there, they would have second thoughts about doing it.
The other question I wanted to ask you related to the bombs. Las Vegas exploited these testings. They advertised, they invited tourists in. How did you feel about all of that?
Well, of course, most of there was only one test here in Vegas before I went in the Army. That was in early January of '51. So I was gone during the early part of it, and was, as I just told you, and came back and gotten directly involved in it. But my recollection of the initial reaction to that first test, that everyone was just kind of in awe of it. I don't think anyone was concerned that they were going to get hurt. I never heard anyone express that, and like you say, they began to advertise it, and some of the people would even go up to Mount Charleston because they would announce the tests, and it would come out in the paper that they're going to have a test. Unless the wind conditions canceled it, then it would be on, you'd know what day. So they would get up and go up to Mount Charleston and sit out up there because you could look down then on the test area. Excuse me, you could actually see the fireball, which you never could see from Las Vegas. The only thing you could see from Las Vegas would be the mushroom cloud, which would go way up in the, in the sky. Of course, you'd feel it in Las Vegas. It'd be like a minor earthquake.
Do you think it was smart for people to go to Mount Charleston?
Well, I was a lot closer than Mount Charleston in 3 atomic explosions. I was about 18 miles, and up at Mount Charleston they would be more like 25 or 30 miles away.
With your military knowledge of what was happening, how close would you have had to have been to the bomb to get the fallout?
Well, the fallout drifted away from the immediate area. It would go up into the sky. I don't know how many thousand feet, thousands of feet into the sky. And then it wouldn't release until, let's say, it was kind of like a cloud, that holds rain. It would become part of a cloud, and the cloud would begin to drift, and then at some point it would be just like rain. The fallout would come down. You couldn't see it, of course, but it would come down more like rain is the way it came down. So the immediate area, as far as I know, didn't have any fallout. Let me tell you this, and might help answer your question. On one of these tests that I'm speaking about, of course, they had what they call radiation safety people, checking radiation all over the place out there. And the ones that went down near ground zero, they were dressed in what would be like a moon suit. Had their own respirating systems and were completely enclosed in this suit. And then they would have instruments that they could carry with them that would measure the radiation. So on one of these tests, 2 days after the test, radiation people went down within 2 miles and found that the radiation level was pretty darn low. So what they did, they said, we got a bus here. You guys want to go down? So, sure, we'll go down.
To ground zero.
Well, 2 miles, within 2 miles of ground zero.
Okay.
And so they loaded about maybe 50 or 60 of us in a bus. We went down there, got out of the bus and looked around and saw some of this equipment. And surprisingly, most of the equipment that was there was not heavily damaged. This surprised me. And I'm not sure why. But anyway, they were that confident, and I had enough confidence in the radiation safety people to take their judgment. So I went down there.
Did you have on the suit?
No, nothing. No, we went down there with just fatigue uniforms on.
So those boats and houses and buildings that they would erect for these bombs testings,
Yeah.
how close were those to ground zero?
Well, there were some of them, they put them in various stages. In other words, they had them, some of them, I'd say probably the closest ones would, and we didn't go there because the radiation level was too high, but I'd say the closest ones might have only been like maybe a couple of thousand feet, like a half a mile. Then they went out as many, probably as maybe 2 or 3 miles. And of course they also had lots of instruments that they put in these areas to measure the heat, the blast, and the radiation. They had all kinds of instruments. Of course that was part of this, let's say the atomic scientist part of the project. I had nothing to do with that.
So this was much more sophisticated than the normal person, the average person even knew about.
Absolutely. They had a lot of real high-paid, I'll call them engineers, I guess, for scientists. I think that would be a better word, that did the real, let's say, they were really the brains out there, and they controlled, like what they would learn from one test, they would try to apply that to the next test and maybe do something a little differently, or maybe they would devise, like I said, they would start devising weapons that had lower radiation levels.
Do you know any of the people, the scientists who work with this kind of equipment? The reason I'm asking, right now we have a project here at UNLV. We've gotten a grant, and we actually have a person hired who's doing special interviewing about the test site. Do you know anyone that you could recommend to this person?
I didn't. We really didn't come in contact with them at all. We were like an army unit that was sent out there to do a certain job, and we did our job, and all the people we dealt with were army people. Some of them from Washington, D.C. came out there from the Pentagon. But anyway, we weren't dealing with the atomic energy people.
Okay, and when I tell her about this interview, it's possible that she might want to talk to you as well. Would that be okay? Now, I'd like to get back to your personal life. We haven't talked about your wife at all. Tell me when you got married and who you married.
Okay, during my Army career, early on, before I was an officer, I was sent to a place called Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, and that's near Harrisburg, which is the capital. It's out in the forest, a beautiful place in the summer, but pretty cold in the winter.
Now, what was the first part of that name?
Indiantown Gap.
how do you spell that first word?
Indian, like Indian.
Okay, yes. Okay.
Indian Town
Okay.
Cap.
Okay.
And it's a very, very old military post. Not as old as Valley Forge, but Valley Forge isn't too far away.
Okay, good.
So anyway, being stationed there, then I, being a good Christian, I went to church, and I met my wife at the church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And we had a very whirlwind courtship, but then I had to leave and go to Officers Candidate School. So she stayed there, and I went to Officers Candidate School in Oklahoma, the artillery school. And when I graduated, then I came back, and we were married 2 days later. And then I had to go back to Oklahoma. I was assigned to the Fort Sill, Oklahoma. So we were married in Harrisburg. We honeymooned at Lake Tahoe, and then went back to Fort Sill to be a young married couple. And that's not too long after that, then I got involved in this unit I'm speaking about that was sent out to the test site.
Okay. Give me your wife's name and a little bit about her background.
Okay, her name is Jane, and it's spelled with a Y, and she was born in Harrisburg and grew up there, and she went 1 year to in high school to a private school, the same place where I think I mentioned my sister going to school in across the river from St. Louis called Principia. They also have a high school there. It's a church school. And so my wife went to this Principia High School near St. Louis for 1 year, and then she graduated, came back, I think it was her sophomore year, came back, and of course I told you how I met her, and then we were married, and then the Korean War got over. I was really supposed to stay in the Army longer, but the Korean War got over, and this was in '53, and I think it was August '53 the war was over. But anyway, they started looking around, and they had too many people in the Army with not a war going on, so they said, well, they sent out orders from the Pentagon, anybody that wants to go home early can. That's what they call an early out. So I put in for an early out. So I came home in November of '53. I got out of the Army as a second lieutenant. However, shortly afterwards, I stayed in the reserves. I became a first lieutenant shortly after I came back. But anyway, I came back to Las Vegas in November of '53. We had a 2-month-old baby coming with us. My wife flew home with the baby, and I drove. So anyway, that's when I came back to Vegas, and then we had another daughter. We have 2 daughters. Another daughter that was kind of funny. One was born in Oklahoma, near, of course, an Indian reservation. I kid them because the Army post was right next to an Indian reservation. So one was born there, and the other was born in Flagstaff, Arizona, and we were going on a trip, and my wife, of course, was pretty pregnant, but we figured, she had about a month to go, so we headed out on a trip, and we didn't get very far. We got as far as Flagstaff, and the baby arrived in Flagstaff. So
that's great. How did your wife feel about Las Vegas after living in a prim, proper place like Philadelphia, Harrisburg?
Harrisburg, yeah. I gave her an opportunity to back out. What happened about halfway through my officer's candidate school, I made arrangements for her to come to Oklahoma. I couldn't leave, but she came to Oklahoma, and my parents came from Las Vegas, and they met there, and of course met each other for the first time, and they brought her to Las Vegas so she could look around. So she had an opportunity to back out, but she didn't.
Okay.
But it was very different. She missed the green and the trees, and so we have a home now with lots of trees.
Now, describe Las Vegas to me at the time that you moved back with your young bride and baby.
Yeah, this would have been late '53, okay? Well, by that time, they had started to build some of the larger hotels. Of course, the first hotel was built like in about 42 or 43, the El Rancho, very small, nothing really more than like a big motel. The next one was the Frontier, which was a little bit bigger, but still nothing more than a big motel. They hadn't built any big places at all. By the time I got back, there was Desert Inn was up, the Thunderbird was up, Stardust, which was, I think, called, no, it was a Stardust, and right next to it, a place called the Royal Nevada, the Sands, Flamingo. Yeah, Flamingo was built about 46. Yeah, that was, still, it wasn't huge, though. The original Flamingo was really not too big. It was bigger than the El Rancho or the Frontier, and it was way out, everybody thought it was way out of town. And I'm sure you know all the story about the Flamingo. It's been in the movies and everything.
Well, were there any local stories that we don't know about that you heard when you returned?
Well, I can tell you some stories about before I went away, but do you want me to about the mob moving in to Las Vegas?
Yes, please. I'd like to hear that from a person who lives here.
Well, first, I can't think now exactly where they came from, but it was the group that had Bugsy Siegel and Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum. That was the group. And they came originally settled down. Excuse me. There's a couple of names I didn't put in there that just came to me, and these are all the same group of gentlemen, if you want to call them gentlemen. Anyway, Berman was another name, and Alderman, and Willie the Ice Pick Alderman. And anyway, they originally started downtown. I can't think of the names of their casinos, but they were downtown on Fremont Street. In the 100 block and the 200 block, they had two casinos, quite, moderate, or, modest compared to even what's down there now. And that's where they started. And then, of course, they started the Flamingo, I think it was in 46. And Siegel was more or less put in charge of that project. And the thing that was, I think, kind of a little side note that I know is, I was on the football team in high school, and one of the fellows that came out, he was not one of the, let's say, the main bosses, but he was like one of their friends that came with them, was a fellow who had been like an assistant trainer, physical trainer I'm speaking about now, for one of the Major League Baseball teams. And so he came with them. So he became the trainer for our football team. We'd never had a trainer before, so he became our trainer. So we got acquainted with him. His name was Lenny Schaefer. And later on, quite a few years later, he was part owner of the Dunes Hotel. But anyway, that was our first contact. The other contact we had is Mo Sedway had two sons, and they were both high school age. And so they went to high school with us. And frankly, we didn't in any way really have any concept of the background of these individuals. We just knew that their father was in gambling, and that's all we knew. We didn't know that they were basically had been crooks and had come to Las Vegas because they, the law enforcement had forced them out of, I think they came from Ohio, but anyway, wherever they came from, they'd been forced out, and they were coming where gambling was legal, where they were before it was illegal. So anyway, we didn't look down on them whatsoever and really didn't know anything about their backgrounds. And I can recall my father's business, where we would go over. My father's business was right down there next to Fremont Street, and so they would call. My father had electricians working for him, so they would call us, and and the only thing I can remember unusual about them is they always paid cash. They never wrote a check. And if we go over and do some work, at the end of the day, they would actually turn around to the electrician and say, how much do we owe you for today's work? And they'd pay him what he had done that day, and then he'd go back the next day, they'd pay him again. So they operated strictly in cash. They didn't want too many records of what was going on. But one other thing I can say about the Flamingo, and this would have been probably shortly after I graduated from high school, I had a friend that worked for this Lenny Schaefer I mentioned. He had a health club at the Flamingo, like, you know, steam baths and massages and things like that. So this high school friend of mine, we were now out of high school a little bit, he worked there for Lenny, and so he was able to get us in out there at the swimming pool. So we could go out to the Flamingo because we knew this guy. He would tell the lifeguard, these guys are okay, don't kick them out. So we would go out there, and one of the days we were out there, and this is when these guys were very young, not too much older than we were, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis were out at the pool. And we, of course, thought that was a big thrill to be sitting there by the pool with Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, because they were already pretty famous. So that happened probably, you know, I'm talking about maybe 1947 or something like that.
That's great. How did the people in Las Vegas, now you weren't aware of the other enterprises of these men. Did Las Vegas begin to suspect anything? How did they feel about these men coming in?
I don't think many people, even the adults, I mean, not only the kids, I don't think the adults knew their backgrounds, and it didn't become known, I don't think, until Bugsy Siegel was assassinated. Then it began to come out. That's the first time, which is probably now up to maybe 1949 or something like that. Then it began to come out. And still, though, I don't think people, let's say, were frightened of them, because I think that they felt, as I look back on it anyway, and although I didn't know much about it, but I think the consensus would have been that they had come to Las Vegas kind of to start over anew, and maybe they turned over a new leaf.
So do you think that's the attitude a lot of people have about Las Vegas, that this is the place where you can start anew?
Well, I think so. Of course, over the years, there's been, you know, Las Vegas has grown so much there's lots of people have come here and started anew, and many of them have made millions of dollars. So,
I want to ask you, I realize that Las Vegas is very small at this point. You're finishing high school, and it's a tiny town.
Right.
Tell me about the crime here.
Practically non-existent, other than people, you know, getting drunk. If you want to call that a crime, I guess it is. Anyway, you didn't bring it out, but prostitution didn't become a crime until the Air Force came in, and they asked the city to kick out the prostitution, which they did. This would have been probably like 1942, but it was still here, but it had to go underground. So anyway, to answer your question more specifically, there were about 25,000 people in all of Clark County when I graduated from high school. Everybody pretty much knew everybody, and if the kids got in trouble, they did have a truant officer / juvenile officer, and the kids, you know, the kind of trouble I'm talking about would be if you would maybe steal some fruit off somebody's fruit trees, or maybe you would ditch school, you know, a lot. That's about as bad as it got. And the jail was tiny. The jail, I think, only had about maybe 8 or 10 cells. So police department was very small.
Did you ever hear anything about the divorces?
Divorces were better known in Reno. Reno, for some reason, took the lead in that, but Las Vegas then tried to play catch-up to them. And they did catch up to them, but the divorces business here did not really kind of, let's say, get into high volume until more up in like in the 50s. And there were a couple of what we would call divorce ranches or dude ranches around, where the ladies would come, mainly ladies, would come and establish their 6 weeks residency, and they would stay at places. There's a couple of them out in area around Warm Springs and Eastern. There were a couple of them out in that area, and then there was one down in North Las Vegas called the Dorado Ranch. So we were aware of, but it really wasn't a big item until in the 50s, and then it started to grow. And then, of course, by that time they had big fancy hotels where a lot of them would spend their 6 weeks in a hotel.
Now, the dude ranches, what did they do all day?
What did they do all day? Mm-hmm. They would, weather permitting, they would swim. They all had swimming pools. They had horses if they wanted to ride horseback. And other than that, I don't know what they would do.
Now, growing up here, do you remember the Eldorado Parades?
Sure.
Tell me about those.
Okay, well, first Eldorado was held in 1935. Of course, it was very small. I'm not sure they even had a parade in 1935. They might have. I really don't remember. But it was held on Fremont Street between 6th and 7th Street. And it was from the beginning, it was sponsored by the local Elks Club. The Elks Club were the sponsors. And it, of course, grew. The parades, as it developed, I can remember they had 3 parades. They would have, not on the same day, they'd have 3 consecutive, like Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. The first day would be what they called the Kiddies Parade, which all the youngsters would dress up and they would parade down the street with their cowboy outfits on, and sometimes we'd make up little things. Like one time I know I went down and I had a wagon, I'm talking about a kid's wagon, fixed up, and it had a sign on it that I was the patent medicine man. And I even had my dad somehow gotten hold of a top hat, so I was the patent medicine man walking down Fremont Street. But the first day was the Kiddies Parade. Second day was the Old Timers Parade, which would be where they had the horses, the wagons, the stagecoaches, and things like that, and lots of people on horseback. The third day was the Beauty Parade. And the third day where they have actually floats. They would build floats, and they would have young ladies in bathing suits. And quite a few, as the hotels were built, they would participate and have quite elaborate floats. And they would usually, in those days, all the hotels had chorus lines. And they would send their float full of chorus girls.
So which day was the most popular?
No contest.
Now, your costume of a medicine man, where did you get that?
Well, my dad was president of the Chamber of Commerce, and for some event that they were having, he got a real top hat. I don't know where it came from. And then my mother, I'm sure, made my costume. Did
you get the idea from real medicine men?
I suppose seeing movies, I would.
Oh, okay. Okay. We didn't have
No, I don't. Okay. I never saw a real medicine man. No. No.
Now, did the parades have bands?
Yes. Yeah, they would have school bands, and as years went by and they got bigger and bigger and bigger, they would have many schools would come in here from out of state and different parts of Nevada. We would have like maybe 4 or 5 bands would come from California to be in the parade.
So what was the purpose of the parade?
Well, it was part of the total celebration. It was the main event was, I suppose, the rodeo. They had a rodeo, except the very first one. They didn't have room for a rodeo, but they had a rodeo. And then they also had what's called the Eldorado Village, which would be like a carnival. And it was built, the first Eldorado Village was built at the corner of Main and Bonanza. And they built, the Elks built the Eldorado Village there, and had little fence built out of split logs, you know, so it looked, you know, rustic. And then the little concession stands were built out of split logs, and it was kind of neat. Then that one got to where it was too close to downtown. I mean, people wanted the property, so they moved then down to the area where Cashman Field is today.
So it was a permanent structure?
Yeah, it was there year-round. First at Main and Bonanza, then they moved down to like it would be like Las Vegas Boulevard North and Washington. It's where Cashman Field is, and they would have the rodeo down at Cashman Field, which is not like at all like it is today. I mean, it was just a big dirt area, and they would build all the. They did have the what they call the chutes and the bleachers. You know, the chutes are where they put the animals for when they let them out, like the bucking broncos and the steers and so forth. And then they had bleachers there for the people to sit in. They left those up the year round. The chutes were there. And the carnival area, what they call the village, it was there, empty, but it was there.
Now, tell me your memories about some of the first movie theaters here.
Okay. First movie theater was the El Portel on Fremont Street between 3rd and 4th. It was also one of the first places that had any form of real air conditioning in Las Vegas. So it was, in the summertime, was very popular, not only for the kids, but for the adults. And because you could go in there and get nice and cool.
How much did it cost?
I really don't know, but I'd say this, it was probably on the order of 25 cents. Is what it was. Somewhere in that, it might have even been only 15 cents for kids. It was pretty reasonable. And the next theater that I'm sure was called the Palace Theater, which was near the corner of Casino Center and Carson. Wasn't right on the corner, but it was near that corner. And I can remember this, my store being, like I mentioned, on Casino Center. This was probably in the, trying to think, probably late 30s. He would give me $1. And for $1, I could go, in those days they didn't serve refreshments in the theaters. They might have had popcorn, I'm not sure about that. But anyway, I could go get a hot dog, a big root beer, and go to the show and still have a little bit of money left over out of $1. Maybe 15 cents I'd have left over.
Do you remember a theater where the people sat outside?
That was before my time.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that was in the general area where the El Portel was built, but that's before, I think even before we moved here.
Now, there was a club that your father was probably a member of. It was called the Exchange Club. Do you remember anything about that, where businessmen would meet and network? Never heard of that.
The Elks Club was one of the old clubs, and the club my dad joined, which was quite old, it started here in Las Vegas in 26, was the Rotary Club. And it's an international organization. Probably the Exchange Club is too, as far as that's concerned. But he belonged to it for over 50 years. And then I joined it and was a member for 20 years myself.
Are you still a member?
No.
Earlier you talked about, in the early 40s, you talked about BMI.
Mm-hmm.
And you were telling me that that's when African Americans really started to pour into the city. Tell me your memories of how the city changed at that point, how it was changing.
Well, of course, there was nothing, absolutely nothing at the location of BMI before they started. It was just strictly desert. And so they built the plant, which was quite a large plant, and some homes, and like I mentioned, that one area, that Carver Park area, was for the black people. But they had, I think, somewhere maybe around 5,000 workers out there at its peak, and so that became, in other words, they made a town there. I mean, there was nothing. They built businesses, stores, schools, hospital, and the plant. Of course, all the houses, little, pretty modest houses, and had to put in, all the utilities and so forth. And they put in a huge water line from Lake Mead. That was the first time any water was drawn out of Lake Mead to come in to Nevada. And they did that because they needed a lot of water in the plant. And they also, that was the first time that they had brought in electricity from Hoover Dam. We had the ability, the allocation for electricity, but we didn't have any need for it. They had more electricity allocated for Nevada than they could use, so they really didn't start bringing it in. This would have been the early 40s before they started bringing in electricity. Then, of course, when they brought it into Henderson, they continued and brought electricity into Vegas, but they didn't bring water into Vegas until the 50s. They didn't bring any water in. But that was the reason that they picked the location. They needed lots of water and a lot of electricity, and that was where in the ore that they made the magnesium from, they got at a place called Gabbs, Nevada, which is, I think, about 100 miles up the road or so, maybe even 150 miles up around Beatty in that area.
So it was easier to get the ore here than to get the water there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you ever see that area as this plant was as it was growing, as the houses were being put in?
Not during construction days. We went out there because they built a high school, and I was involved with, I mentioned football, so we went out there to play football. So they had a high school and had a football team, and I at one point, one summer, this was after the war was over, they shut the plant down in 44 because they had enough magnesium, they didn't need any more. So I went out there one summer, I think it would have been probably 46 or 47, and actually worked in the plant, but at that time they were not making magnesium at all. In fact, what they were doing when I went there, they were converting some of the magnesium plant to some sort of a chemical company's use. I don't really know what chemical company, because we were working for a contractor, a big contractor, one of the biggest in the whole United States, called Bechtel McCone. But they had a contract to convert this factory over to a different use. And I was just a little lowly electrician's helper.
Okay. Your mother, I think you told me that your mother didn't work outside the house, but that she was involved socially, different clubs.
Well, she was always, I'm trying to think, she was always so involved with church. She was one of the leaders of the Christian Science Church here, and it was small in those days, and so everyone had to do lots of things. And so she spent an awful lot of time working for the church. And trying to think, she wasn't a member of one of the pioneer clubs. Was called a women's club. It's called the Mesquite Club. You may have heard of that. She was not a member of the Mesquite Club. when I was trying to think, my dad belonged to the American Legion and belonged to Rotary Club. I don't think my mother ever belonged to a women's club.
Okay. What was your mom's life like?
Well, other than her church work, she loved flowers, and she always had lots of flowers, and she would get out there and do the gardening, and we had flowers and fruit trees and grapes everywhere we lived. I don't think I've ever mentioned this in my talk, that the house that we moved into after we moved off from 4th Street, my parents built a house on South 7th Street, just 2 blocks down from the high school. And it was rather modest, but in those days people didn't build big houses. They couldn't afford them and didn't think they needed them. But anyway, that's where I really spent most of my growing up days until I went in the Army. Of course, I went to school, I mentioned, in Reno, but lived on South 7th Street on the corner of 7th and Bonneville. And it was real easy to go to high school because I could just walk out the door in the morning. I could hear what we called the first bell ring. And if I ran all the way to school, I could get in my seat before the second bell rang.
So your mom was considered a homemaker.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, your mom also had a college education, is that
Yes.
correct?
Correct. Taught school for 3 years.
She did teach school. Now, where did she teach?
She taught school in Tonopah, in the Hawaiian Islands of Maui, and in Reno.
That's right.
That was before she got married.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, could she have continued to teach school after she got married?
I don't know the answer to that for sure, but I've kind of somehow gotten the impression that married school teachers were rare. That's the impression I've gotten. That I think back about my school teachers, I don't think that any of them were married.
That's right. Now, at this point, we've gotten to the point now that we have casinos here already, and the Strip is building up. What kind of entertainment did the locals engage in?
Well, as far as the teenagers are concerned, we had I thought, a wonderful facility and was well used. During the war, they built a USO club here in Las Vegas. It was downtown on Stewart Street near City Hall. Of course, it's not there anymore. But at the end of the war, they gave that club, the USO club, to the city of Las Vegas. So the city of Las Vegas turned it into a teenage club, and it was very well run. They had, paid employees, just 1 or 2 that ran it, but they had a dance floor, they had a small stage, they had pool tables, they had ping pong tables, and I'm trying to think if they served any food in there. I don't think so. I'm sure we had lots of soda pop, but it was a gathering place for the teenagers, and they would have activities every Friday and Saturday night, and then my recollection too that for a few hours it was open during the week, like maybe not in the evening, but maybe late afternoon. This may be like from 4 to 6 or something like that. So that was a real good place. Kids today love cars, although during the war very few people had cars. A few of the kids had cars, but they were usually old, what we call clunkers, or occasionally if someone had enough money to fix one up, then it would become, from a clunker, it would become a hot rod. So we walked a lot, and when we went on dates, we would almost always borrow a car from one of our parents, and then we would load the car up with people. In other words, we'd go around the different houses and pick up the people, and then of course when the date was over, you reversed the process. But you'd very rarely go out on a date with less than 6 people in the car, sometimes as many as 8 people in one car.
How did you
fit? Well, the girls would sit on the boys' laps. That wasn't all bad. So, anyway, except for the driver, of course. So that was, and we had a couple of small drive-in restaurants. So when you went on a date, you'd probably go to a movie, and then you would, what we call, cruise Fremont Street. And you just kind of drive up and down Fremont Street for a while and see who was out. And then you would go to a drive-in and have maybe a hamburger or a milkshake or something. That was a big evening.
How much did the date cost?
Oh, I've forgotten, but one thing I can say, this was a little bit after the period I'm speaking about, but it's in the same train of thought. When I came back out of the Army, and we now had, 4 or 5 hotels that had shows, you could go to a second show, which would be, they had a first show at the hotels, which was a dinner show. And you'd have dinner, and then you'd see a show. And quite a few of them, you could dance between eating dinner, and before the show started, the orchestra would play for a little while, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and you could dance on the stage. Because the stages were very low, down, not much higher than the tables. So anyway, to get to the point, the first show was a dinner show, which was a little expensive for us unless my parents were taking us. We would go sometimes to the dinner show. But you could go to the second show, which I've forgotten what time it was. It was quite a bit later. But the second show you could go to, and all you had to do was pay for drinks. Of course, when you were a teenager, you weren't allowed to drink alcohol, but you could order a Coke, and it was 50 cents, which was an awful lot of money for a Coke. But you could order Coke for yourself and a Coke for your date for $1. You could sit there and see a wonderful show, and you maybe give the waitress a quarter tip.
That's great.
And so that was. We also would go to a place called, in the summertime, we quite often went to a place called Twin Lakes or Lorenzi Park. It has 2 names. And they had a huge swimming pool there, and we would go there on dates. We also occasionally would go to Lake Mead if we had a car, which, like I said, a lot of times in high school we didn't have a car.
Did you ever go to Mount Charleston for dates or for recreation?
Family, a fair amount, and I tell you this story because it's a good one. It's not a personal story, but it shows you what people did in order to try to get cool in the early days in Las Vegas. Mount Charleston was developed really during the 30s. They had a Ccc Camp, which is, you know what Ccc was? It's like a paramilitary organization for young men during the Depression years to give them jobs, and they built things all over the United States. So they did really what I developed. They built roads, they built campsites for picnic tables, camp stoves and things, and they also built a children's camp for summer camp. They built that up at Mount Charleston. All this was built during the 30s. So there were very few homes at Mount Charleston initially, and there was one little tiny lodge, like a little tiny, as I recall, a place to eat, and I'm sure they served some kind of drinks. No gambling, I know that, but anyway, there was a small lodge and a few cabins, and then what I've mentioned, the campgrounds and so forth. But to answer your question, people would, even before these places were built, before they had established campgrounds, people would take camping equipment like cots, blankets, little tiny stoves, like charcoal burners, and they would go up there and spend the weekend. They just go up there and, pull off to the side of the road and establish themselves a little campground. They'd have to take their own water, and of course, if you wanted to go to the bathroom, you'd have to go find a clump of trees and go to the bathroom. But after the CCCs began to develop the area, then they had running water to the campsites. They had bathrooms, outhouse-type bathrooms, and the campsites were with picnic tables and little stoves. That came not too many years later. I'd say probably like maybe 33, 34, 35, along in that area when they got developed. But the family, we went quite a few weekends. We'd go up there just to cool off. Even if you didn't camp out, you'd go up maybe on Sunday just to cool off and spend Sunday. You'd maybe just take a little light picnic lunch, and you'd spend, at least maybe Sunday afternoon you'd spend in the cool air.
How much cooler is it, or was it?
About 20 degrees. 20 degrees. So if it was 100 down there, it would be 80. And also, it would be probably more than 20 degrees less at night. It would really cool off at night up there.
Okay. Now, in 1955, a casino opened called the Moulin Rouge. Do you remember that? Were you back by that time?
Yeah, I was back. Yeah.
What do you remember about that period, about that opening?
Well, I remember that it was built. I know it was built for black people. I assume that it was built by black people. The owners, I'm not sure about that. But it was the first time that a black person could go into a nice show and a nice restaurant. Before that, they were not allowed to go into the strip hotels. And the entertainers that worked there, you probably have heard this, the entertainers that worked there who were black, they couldn't even stay there in the hotel. They had to go over to the west side to stay. I think that was the major thing, and I don't think I was ever inside of it. Not that I was told not to go, but it was mixed. They had mixed clientele. I mean, it wasn't totally black. And a lot of the entertainers then that were appearing on the strip, they would either stay there at the Moulin Rouge, or if not, they would at least frequent the Moulin Rouge as part of, let's say, the audience. I don't know that they could afford to have, the real stars. They probably didn't have the money to do that, but it didn't last too long. I don't remember now what happened, but it didn't stay open too long. I know that, and I know that recently it burned. Yeah.
I can believe that.
Yeah.
Yes, it did. Well, over the years, how have you felt about living in a tourist town?
Good question. Well, first of all, it didn't really become a tourist town as far as I'm concerned until about mid-50s. And of course, then it's just gone up and up and up. The tourism has gone, I don't know the figures, but anyway, it's gone crazy. But in my growing up years, and even when I first came back to Vegas, it was just beginning to be a tourist town in the mid-50s. But the thing that I say about it, that people, especially people that you meet outside of Las Vegas that have never been to Las Vegas, and they've seen only on maybe in the television or in a movie or whatever, they've seen mainly the Strip. They want to know, how do you live there? What do you do? Do you spend all your time in the casinos? And I assure them that outside of the Strip area, even today, as there's always been, there's a community, and the community is not too much unlike other communities, that we have doctors, lawyers, gas stations, and places to eat, and we have schools and churches, and I assure them of that.
Do you remember when we had the W Brown Racetrack?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
You're one of the first who actually remember that. What do you remember about it?
Well, I remember where it was. It's at the location basically where the convention center is today. That's where it was located. And of course, there's a street out there named after Joe Brown. And he was a promoter. I don't know if he had a racetrack before. I don't know this, but he came to town and sold shares in the racetrack. In other words, it was a venture, I guess you call it a capital venture, and quite a few local people invested in it. And he built, of course, had to build a racetrack and grandstand and so forth, but it didn't last long at all. It seemed to me that he only had maybe what they call 2 racing seasons. And he didn't attract very big crowds. And of course, most places in those days, if you went to California, basically the only place you could bet a lot of money was at the racetrack. I'm talking, I'm talking now. I think he was out there probably in the very early 50s with his racetrack. And if you'd go to Santa Anita, which is huge, but if you wanted to bet money, that's about the only place you could legally bet money, unless you went to a few poker palaces. But anyway, and there was another place called Del Mar racetrack. But anyway, the Californians, they thought they were going to get those people that went to the racetracks in California to come up here. And evidently not too many of them ever came. And so I think it was just 2 seasons that he raced, and then it just stood there empty for a while, and then the convention center came along and they bought the property.
Do you remember the lunch counter at White Cross Drugstore?
Absolutely.
Tell me about the food.
It was right across the street from my dad's store. So, see, his store was in the middle of the block. See, it was on the corner of Casino Center and Fremont. And my dad's store was on Casino Center, just down a half a block. So it was a favorite. Of course, it was a little bit of a treat for us to go there. Not that it was so fancy, but it was very popular. People would stand behind. In other words, they only had, I think, I don't think there was one booth even. It was all counter. And I think they only had maybe 12 to 14 seats at the counter. And so it was, during the middle of the day, it was always busy, and you'd go over there and stand behind someone who was seated, and when they finished, of course, you got their seat. But it was a limited menu, but very good food, and of course, the kids, we always liked ice cream, sodas, and root beer floats, and we'd have usually the sandwich. I'm sure they had at least 1 or 2 hot, like maybe roast beef or something like that, or maybe fried chicken or something. But it was famous in the town. Of course, again, the town was very small, and there were other places to eat, but the White Cross was also kind of a meeting place too for the businessmen. In other words, they'd go down there and sit on the stool and eat lunch and talk to the guy next to him, and they'd talk business. Very well known.
Do you remember the Blue Onion?
There was a Blue Onion drive-in restaurant, a Blue Onion, and then later there was a Blue Onion motel, the same location.
Oh, really?
Yes. The drive-in closed, and then they more or less went into the, originally there was just a drive-in restaurant. That's what it was.
The waitresses were on roller skates?
I'd forgotten that. Maybe. Maybe.
Okay. Earlier you said something about I want to ask about transportation. You said something earlier about people going back and forth to the dams. They had buses to do that. What about people as the city got larger? What kind of transportation did we have here?
Well, good question. I know the bus system came in quite a long time. I'm trying to think if there were buses when I came back out of the Army. That's what I was trying to think. And I'm not sure there were, if there were buses when I came back out of the Army, it was on a very limited schedule and possibly up and down the strip. But I know when I was in high school, of course that was war years, there were not any buses other than a bus that would go out to Boulder City, like I mentioned, a bus to go to Henderson. They were funny buses, but they ran, and they did have a little tiny, and it was just like a station wagon car that occasionally went to Mount Charleston when I was in high school. And there was also a bus line that ran all the way from Vegas to Reno, and stopped, of course, in all the intermediate places.
Okay. Now, for the test site in the 50s, was there bus service for the people working there?
Yeah. A lot of people drove, but as the time went on and they had quite a few accidents on that road, people would go to sleep. They would get up, they went out there very early in the morning, and then they came back after, being up all day, and quite a few accidents. So buses became pretty popular. They ran lots of buses to the test site. Yeah, sure did.
The last portion that I want to ask you about are the 1960s. What do you remember about Las Vegas in the 60s?
Trying to think what I was doing in the 60s.
This was a time for...
I would have been working, of course, in my father's business. We would have been located on Charleston at this time, on East Charleston Boulevard.
Before we talk about that, what else, did you work in the business for all of your career? Did you do other
after
things?
I got out of the Army, yes.
Okay.
Sure did.
So did you take the business over at that point?
Not at that point. My father was old-fashioned, and he felt that I had to start at the bottom and work my way up. So I did. It only took me about 20 years to become the boss. That's right. So.
Long way from the bottom.
Yeah. But I enjoyed it. I did everything, and it was fairly small business. It never got real big, but anyway, I'm trying to think in the 60s, what was I doing in the 60s? Boy, my kids would have been in school. They would have been, in the 60s, they would have been, like probably in 5th grade or something like that. I'm trying to think.
Were the schools integrated at that point?
Schools were, at that point, trying to think. High school was integrated from the very beginning, although the blacks were. High school was integrated, and I mentioned having this school on the west side, which was, of course, totally black, but it only went up to the 3rd grade. So we were integrated from the 3rd grade on up, from the beginning. There was another small school in North Las Vegas back in the 30s, but it again only, I think, went up to the 3rd grade. But in those days, I don't think there were any black people who lived in North Las Vegas in the 30s. Pretty sure there weren't.
Okay. So on your football team, did you have any black players?
2. Yeah. But there weren't many in the whole school. I'd say that when I was a senior even, which was 1946, in the whole school, and we had 4 years of school. There weren't any junior high schools. There were about 1,000 kids in the high school. And I'd say there were probably 200 maybe black students in the high school out of that 1,000.
And that probably makes sense because we talk about 1946.
Yes.
And BMI opened in the early 40s.
Correct.
So those families had just started to come in, 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, they'd been in, families had been here probably for 3 or 4 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Anything about business in the 60s or war protest, integration, any of those events you remember?
Well, I don't remember when this happened, to be honest with you. Maybe you do, but I think it's more. It's got to be more recent than the '60s. That the only, excuse me, that going back, I'm not sure when the hotels opened up to black people. I'm not sure when that happened. 60s? Okay. But there was, and this was, I think must have been in the 70s, when they had actually, I'd say, like riots on the west side, where they were, it was about the same time that they were having riots in California in the Watts area. And I think that was probably about the 70s. They actually had riots where they burned buildings over on the west side, and they had to send a large number of policemen over there, and I think even some National Guard troops.
Do you remember the reason that was given for those riots here?
Not really, except I think it was probably somewhat, this is only speculation, had something to do with the riots in California. I mean, that it happened there, I think, first before it happened here.
Okay. Have you seen over the years the business climate changing, or how did it change for a private business owner?
Well, on that same point, I think you're getting onto it, and I think I said it before, and I'm not sure I said it before you turned your machine on, but we had a lot of black customers, so that I went onto the west side. Not that I'm saying I'm a hero or anything, but I'm just saying that my father started it very early on, when there were just a very few black people that lived downtown in Las Vegas, and he granted credit to black people, which was almost unheard of. And of course, if you grant credit to one person, they would tell their friends, and so we had quite a few customers on the west side. I was over on the west side. Like I said, I wasn't lying to you. I was over on the west side almost every day for business reasons. So I'm trying to think what the last question you asked me.
About the business climate changing.
Business climate changing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's really, and without being cynical or sour graping, that's really what put our store out of business, was the business climate changing. As Las Vegas grew, then chain stores began to come into Las Vegas. Of course, we had Sears very early on. Sears came in probably clear back maybe in 36 or something like that. But that was, J.C. Penney's was here. But they didn't have stores that were appliance oriented. Even Sears in those days didn't have, in the early days, didn't have appliances, not major appliances. So in any event, as the town grew, then the bigger chain stores came in, and the little guys, like our store, which was Luce and Goodfellow, had a hard time surviving, and we didn't really survive. And it not only happened to us. I know of 4 other smaller appliance stores similar to myself that all went out of business within about 5 years here in Las Vegas. But the same thing happened to other merchants. Unless you had a niche, what I mean by a niche, that maybe you had something that you really specialized in that maybe the big stores didn't have, or they didn't have the variety that you had, it was tough for the small businessman to survive. Same thing is true with the small casinos. They didn't survive either.
Tell me how you feel about the Walmarts of the world today.
Well, I might say that I had a taste of the other side, because when I closed my store and needed to work, because not so much financially, but I wanted something to do, and I wasn't really, I felt old enough to retire, I went to work for Sears. And by this time, of course, Sears was a very dominant figure in the appliance business. So I was doing basically what I'd done most of my life, except I wasn't the boss anymore. So I saw the other side of it from the, let's say, the chain store side. And they do some things much better than we did. They're better organized, their salespeople are better trained, their displays are much better, they have much more variety of product, and so they have some big advantages. The big advantage that they have over the small business person is that their buying power. In other words, they could buy the same item that I used to buy at a much lower price from the manufacturer. So that's where their edge is. So as far as Walmart's concerned, they of course have gone way, way past Sears as far as volume's concerned. They do probably almost 3 times as much business as Sears. And, I admire the family they started out just kind of like I did with one little store in Arkansas. So, but they had a big vision and they followed their vision. But you certainly, one thing you do lose in the larger business is you lose personal relationship between the entrepreneur or proprietorship and the customer. You don't know the customers, they don't know you, and you try to treat them. At Sears, we were taught, of course, to be very polite and do our very best for them, but you don't really know them.
What is your attitude and those of your friends about gambling?
Well, I probably have a little different attitude, but not so different than the Mormons, because in our church we don't gamble. A person who is a Christian Scientist, who is let's say a devout Christian Scientist, would not gamble at all, period, not one nickel. So, and the Mormons...
Lottery?
Pardon?
Play the lottery?
No.
Okay.
No lottery. The Mormons, if they're devout Mormons, they're the same way. So we're not alone in Las Vegas in that aspect. However, I do know, and we have this happen in our church, occasionally we'll have someone who actually works in the business, and the Mormons do too. I frankly would find that difficult. It's rare in our church, but I don't know how rare it is in the Mormon church.
But now, in a town like this where so much employment is associated with the gaming industry, isn't there some forgiveness or some leeway for someone going into the industry?
Our church, this is the way we draw the line in our church. I don't know what the Mormons do, but in our church we draw the line. If you're in a job that you're not actually dealing the cards, you're not serving the booze, we would say, fine, you can work in a hotel, you can work in a shop in a hotel. In fact, my wife at one time ran a shop, in Caesar's Palace. She didn't own it, but she was the manager. And we've had people who have been very, very, good church members in every way and have worked maybe as we've had entertainers in our church, worked as musicians or singers and dancers.
Dancer?
Pardon?
Is dancing not, is that okay?
Oh yeah, that's okay. Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. What do you see as the future of Las Vegas?
Future of Las Vegas. Well, I'm always been kind of I've been on the conservative side. I keep I've been saying for the last 50 years, it's got to stop. It can't get bigger. It's got to stop. But it doesn't ever seem to stop growing. So from the track record of the last 50 years, I'd say it's going to keep growing. There's the water problem that is possibly going to slow us down. They're facing, right now, severe water problems. Water, I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know, is water is the reason there is a Las Vegas. So we're back, from that sense, we're back to the beginning.
One question, one series of questions that I want to end with. I want to talk about your wife. I didn't ask you about her working outside the home, and I'd like to know also, compound question, your children, their names.
Okay, I'll start with my wife. She had worked when we were married after we were married, she didn't work for approximately 20 years. Then after the children were, by that time they were, children were born fairly early in our marriage, so let's say the kids were out of high school. Then she began to work for a lady who had gift stores in several hotels. She had became acquainted with her through playing tennis. So anyway, she started working for her. Then I mentioned she became a manager. One of the shops this lady owned was in the Caesar's Palace. So she did what I'm called a gift shop. It was mainly children's things, toys and children's clothing. So she did that for, I don't know, maybe 10 years. Then she retired for a couple of years, went back to playing tennis for a couple of years. Then she got interested in travel, and she went to a travel agent, and she had this trip all planned, and the travel agent said, "Why'd you come to me? You've got it all planned." Says, "You've got all my work done. Does you want a job?" So he said, "There's going to be a school this summer. You go to that school, come back, I'll give you a job." So she turned out that she was a travel agent then for over 20 years. So now that's her vocational activity. She doesn't do anything now. The children, I have two daughters. One's a school teacher. She's been a school teacher in Las Vegas. She went to the same school my sister went to. It's a church school, college, graduated with high honors, came back, got married, had kids, but has been a school teacher now for 20 years. The other daughter went to school in Reno, had a hard time getting through school, just kind of like I was, played around a lot, and she finally got out of school after about 6 years and became advertising representative for a real small local newspaper. Newspaper went out of business. She went to work for the Review Journal, worked for them for about 6 years, felt she'd hit a dead end. She couldn't go anyplace. So she moved to California, went to work for a bigger newspaper. She works for the Orange County Register. And she has lived in Southern California now for 18 years.
Wonderful.
Not married. She has done well. She's got her own house. It's about half paid for, and she's got a fancy car, and she does well.
That's wonderful. And my very last question is, how long were you with Sears?
7 years.
Okay. So, any closing comments about life in Las Vegas?
Well, I'd just like to emphasize the fact that I think there's a real stable backbone to the community. What I mean by that is there's people who have good morals, and there's lots of churches in Las Vegas. There's lots of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and people are interested in their kids. And I think the schools, although sometimes the papers make out that they're not so good, I think they all around do a pretty good job. And I now have grandchildren growing up here.
This is Claytee White, and I'm here with Mr. Darrell Luce, and it is October 6, 2003. How are you this morning, Mr. Luce?
Oh, I'm just fine and happy to come back and finish up my interview.
That's wonderful. One of the things when I was listening to the tape that we made the other day, you mentioned while talking about Boulder City that it was inside the fence?
That's correct, yes. There was a fence across the road, and it was the only entrance to Boulder City, and I'm not sure how far the fence extended to the side, but there was no way a vehicle could enter without going to a gate, and the guards would stop all vehicles and ask for identification.
Okay, so it was an actual gate there. So it was almost like a gated community.
Oh, yes, very much so, with guards.
Yes.
24 hours a day.
When you talked about downtown, there was a block 15 and a block 16. Could you give me, just for the record, which street we're talking about?
Block 16 was on North 1st Street. I know that. To be honest with you, I'm not sure where Block 15 was. It was possibly, it was on, on 2nd Street in those days. Today that's Casino Center, but I'm pretty sure it was on North. It was North 2nd, I think, was where 15 was. I'm not positive.
Thank you. At one time on the west side, and I'm asking you this because of your travels back and forth to the west side, there was a lot of nightlife over there. Were you familiar at all with Jackson Street and what it looks like?
Well, that was the only thing I can remember that's on the corner of D and Jackson. There was some sort of a very small, I mean tiny, gambling casino and bar, and I think it was called the Town Tavern. That's my recollection. That was on the corner, and then later on, and this was probably clear up into the 60s, there on the opposite corner there was a small hotel, like about a 3-story hotel. I don't remember the name of it, and my recollection too of that they it didn't stay open too long. That's about my only.
Okay, so you don't remember any beauty shops or restaurants or anything like that?
The only I mentioned the other day, I think, that on the corner or near the corner, I think it was on the corner of Bonanza and D Street, there were 2 small stores. There was a grocery store and a liquor store. The liquor store was run by Gilbert, was the name, and it was called Gilbert Brothers, I think. And the small grocery store was run by a man by the name of Snyder. His name was, first name, an unusual first name is Lincoln Snyder. And they were both white people. But they stayed, they were, I'm not sure when they started, to be honest with you, but they were there, up, I know, going, you might say, great guns in the 40s, and I'm not sure how long they lasted, when they closed up. Kind of foggy on that point.
Okay. When you were in high school, at one point you went to a military high school near or in San Diego. Can you tell me why your parents took you out of that school?
Well, it's probably a better reason why they put me in it.
Tell us about that as well.
In the eighth grade, unfortunately, I got in quite a violent argument with one of the teachers in the 8th grade, and I was disciplined for it. And of course, my parents were very embarrassed, so they felt that I needed some discipline. So I went, the 9th grade is when I went to this military academy on the place called Pacific Beach, which is a suburb of San Diego. And I more or less, you might say, served my term in discipline for a year. And then I came back to Vegas and finished high school at Las Vegas High School.
So did the discipline help?
Well, it got me interested in the military activity, and fortunately, Las Vegas High School had never had ROTC before, but in my junior year, they started an ROTC unit, and so I, of course, jumped right in. Because of my prior training, I became an officer right away in the ROTC. So then I went on and took ROTC at University of Nevada in Reno. And however, because I never graduated from UNR, I never got my commission, I actually finished my ROTC because I was ahead of, when I went to Reno, they jumped me ahead 2 years in ROTC, but I didn't get the commission because I didn't have my diploma.
But that's a really good example of making lemonade out of lemons, isn't it?
Yeah, but I went on and got a commission after going into the Army. Went through OCS.
Good. Describe the railroad cottages to me, your earliest recollection of what railroad cottages look like.
Well, my recollection is that there were two models. There was a real basic model, and they were made out of larger than they use today, concrete blocks, much larger though than the ones, probably about double the size of the ones they use today, and they were made here in Las Vegas. Of course, the railroad had workers, and they made the blocks actually here in Vegas. And of course, the railroad ran the town in the early days. They were the bosses of everything, and they were in the area. I know there was on 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Street in the, I'd say must have been in the 3 and the 400 block on South. I'm speaking about South now. South, 2nd, 3rd, and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd for sure. And I'm almost thinking there were a few of them maybe on 4th Street. Across from where I lived, I think there was some railroad houses. I'm kind of fogged first. At this time, I'm talking about I was only about 4 or 5 years old. I do know just from reading the papers that most of them today are gone. There's just maybe a few, just a handful left. Most of them have been torn down in the buildings and law offices or whatever.
So how many rooms do you think most of the houses contained?
Oh, trying to think back. I think the smaller ones were probably 2-bedroom, kitchen, bath, and a living room. And the larger ones must have been 3-bedroom.
Could you tell me, when you said that this was a railroad town, can you give me any examples of the kind of influence that you saw or that you felt as a result of being a railroad town?
Well, as my early recollection, a lot of the people that lived, I know, right across the street from us when we lived on 4th Street were railroad workers. They were like engineers, conductors, whatever. A little later on, and I don't know what they called them, this was in the 40s, they built a few homes, the railroad I'm speaking about, a few homes back on the other side of the railroad tracks. It would be today in the area that belongs to the city, and that city is trying to, get something going over there. That's the area where it would be. It would be between the freeway today, between the freeway and the railroad tracks, but on the west side of the tracks.
So on the other side from the new shopping center, that new...
Yeah, in that area.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
in that area.
Yeah. They had, of course, repair shops for locomotives way back, and I'm not sure when it stopped operation, maybe, I don't know, but they had the huge ice plant. It was right alongside the railroad tracks where they manufactured ice to put in the cars to keep the fruit that was being shipped from California to the east. And also, of course, in the early days, they supplied all the ice for the ice boxes because we didn't have refrigerators. We had ice boxes when I was a little tiny guy. Of course, my dad started selling refrigerators after they were available. The railroad station itself was roughly where the Union Plaza Hotel is, and it was for a small town. Of course, it was the biggest thing in town, and they had a little park in front of it towards like if you look from the railroad station, you look right down Fremont Street, but between the railroad station was right over next to the tracks, and for probably, maybe a couple of 100 feet, there was like a little park with trees and grass, which was a big deal in those days. Shade, and it was green. And so that's about all I can think of.
Thank you. You mentioned also when you were in the San Diego area, it was around World War II. It was during World War II.
Correct.
And you mentioned that some of the factories were camouflaged.
That's correct.
What kind of factories were those?
I think they were mainly airplane manufacturing plants.
Okay. I want to talk just a little about the image of Las Vegas. You were here when there were Eldorado Parades. And now we're just the opposite now. We have all these skyscrapers and everything is high tech. Where is the real Las Vegas for you?
Well, today, where's the real Las Vegas?
What is your image of Las Vegas?
Well, my image today is that I'm living in the city, but yet I purposely make a conscientious effort to stay away from the Strip, mainly enough because of the crowds and the people, the traffic. So I have more or less an area that I travel in that's off from the Strip, and of course I know the center of the city real well. Of course, the outskirts of the city that have grown I am not familiar with at all. Well, I won't say not at all, but not very familiar with them. And church that I go to is in the old part of the city, and what would you call downtown Las Vegas. I live on the outskirts of downtown Las Vegas, and I shop in that area, and I as I say, very rarely, I kind of keep into that part of town, I'd say 90% of the time. And it's, of course, even that part of the town is not like it was many years ago. The area where I lived was right off from West Charleston, for the University Medical Center in that area, and there was a hospital there when I grew up, a very small hospital. We used to call it the county hospital in those days, but that was really the edge of town as you went out West Charleston, and you did turn down, the street was there and went past and curved, I shouldn't say turned, it curved and went over to Bonanza. There was a street there, but there wasn't much along it. There were a few homes, and one of the early elite, very elite sections was on Rancho. It was called Rancho Circle, which is near Rancho and Alta today. It's still there. It's quite a small area, but very exclusive, and the homes today are all that are there. They're mostly older homes, but they all, are priced between $1 million and $3 million. But it was there, I'd say in the 40s even. There were a few homes. In fact, I know there were some homes in there in the 40s.
Do you think Las Vegas, the way the world sees us today, do you think we could do anything like bring back the Eldorado Parade?
No. No. It wouldn't. I don't think it would be appeal to people, and it was more like where they have. I've never been there, but there's 2 or 3 places in the country that are much smaller than Las Vegas that have a celebration centered around a rodeo, and I know there's also one in Canada. They call it the Calgary Stampede. Reno still has one. They have one that's centered around 4th of July celebration. But it's something that I think that a smaller community can get involved with, and we've lost the western atmosphere here, I think, so I don't think it would go at all.
Now, next year, or year after next, 2005, we're going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Las Vegas. From your past, from the 30s and 40s, what do you think we should include in that celebration? If you just had to mention a couple of things right off the top of your head.
Well, I think that certainly the Eldorado ought to be mentioned for sure. I don't think it should be forgotten. I think the railroad's influence in the community, because there wouldn't really be a Las Vegas if it hadn't have been for the railroad. They, when they first got the tracks going all the way from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City, they had to have places to stop where there was water. And so that's why they picked Las Vegas among other places. But if it wasn't for the railroad, there wouldn't be a Las Vegas. And there wouldn't be a railroad wouldn't have come unless there was water here. So I think that ought to be pointed out to the people. And one thing I don't think I said the other day, and I'm going to get a little bit into my father now because it's a good, I think he called it a segue. Anyway, the Union Pacific had all the utilities in the beginning, every one of them. They owned them all. But the one they held on to the longest was the water. And they held on to the water clear up into the early 50s. And at that point, of course, Las Vegas was beginning to grow quite rapidly. And the Union Pacific was very conservative, and they didn't want to expand the water system very fast. So some of the businessmen in the community were very, discouraged about this. They were holding back, in other words, expansion. So they went to the state legislature. My father was one of them, and they got the legislature to pass a law that allowed them to issue some sort of bonds, and they bought the water district, or the Union Pacific called it the Land and Water Company, and this bill allowed them to set up, which is now called I think they call it the Las Vegas Valley Water District. And it allowed them to set that agency up and buy the water system, and then they were able to immediately begin, after they took over, begin to expand it, and also they began to install water meters for the first time. Before that, we didn't have any water meters, and water was sold. Each house paid just a flat rate each month. It was quite a low rate. You could use as much water as you wanted. But the big thing was they needed to expand, and so they could build more houses and businesses. And then my dad it was a nonprofit, basically non-paying job, but he became the president of the water district. And he served as president for, I don't remember how many years, but quite a number of years. And today there's a reservoir out in the western part of the valley that was built much later on, like was built along probably in the 70s, but it's named after my father. It's near like Cheyenne and Buffalo in the area. And when it was built, of course, it was way out there. In fact, there wasn't even a road out there that was paved. We went out there when they dedicated it, and you bumped along and were driving on rocks and everything to get to the reservoir. But, of course, reservoirs, they always build them, or try to build them in an area that's higher than the area that they're going to supply the water to. So the water is pumped in the reservoir, and then it can flow out through natural flow. But he did that, and then he also was a city commissioner back in the 30s. He served as city commissioner. He was also president of the Chamber of Commerce back in the 30s. So he was very active. Later, during World War II, he served on a board that was a very unpopular board, but it was a board that had to do with controlling ration stamps. I can't think what they called it, but if you in the war years, if you wanted gasoline, you wanted tires, you wanted sugar, you wanted meat or butter, you had to have ration stamps. And if you wanted to get extra ration stamps or for some reason, you'd have to go to the ration board, I guess that's what they called them, and plead your case. So he was on that board. Later on, this was clear up into the 50s and 60s. He served on the Selective Service Board, which most people call the draft board. And then I replaced him when he got to the point where they had a mandatory age of retirement. Well, then I took his place, and I served during the Vietnam years, which is a tough job because you were making a decision basically on who was probably going to wind up in Vietnam. So I did that later on, took his place, and I was president of the Selective Service Board.
So now, how does that work? You under which government agency?
That's what's called the Selective Service System.
And it's part of?
Federal government.
Okay, it's a completely different department. It's
Yeah.
not part of is it part of defense?
I suppose, I don't know.
Okay.
It's all civilians, and they're volunteer. I shouldn't say all. That's not correct. They do have paid workers, but the boards themselves that were set up in every community, they were civilians and got no pay whatsoever. And they would have, like the one here, excuse me, my recollection of it was that they only had one paid worker that ran an office that was in the federal building, in the Foley building, in the days when I was on the board.
Now, how often did you meet as a board, approximately?
We would meet at least once a month, and then if there was like a workload that was heavier, we would meet a second time. We had to interview, and this was the toughest part of the job. You had to interview every young man who applied for conscientious objection. So a lot of the work was just like paperwork. You would see names on a list, but the ones that were conscientious objectors, you saw the young men face to face. They would come in and you would talk to them to see if they were, if you felt they were really sincere about being a conscientious objector.
Were there women on that board?
No.
Okay. Any cases that you remember that you can share?
Well, I remember one because the general trend was, first of all, the conscientious objector did not, if he was granted that classification, and that's what they called it, he would not be completely free from any obligation. He would either be put in one or two categories. He would either be put in a non-combatant role and still have to go into the service. That would be one category. The other category, he would not have to go into the service at all, but he would have to serve in like a veterans hospital or some federal building. He would have to be like the janitor. In other words, he was required to do some service for the federal government, but not in the service. He would still be allowed to remain a civilian.
What determined who went into which category?
Well, it's been a while, been about 30 years ago, but the general thing was there were some young men, for religious reasons, who didn't want to take orders from a military person. They did not want to salute the flag. And those would be the people that would go into civilian, civilian federal work.
Did they get paid the same as a soldier?
I don't remember that. Really don't.
Okay.
I can't answer that. And then, like I said, the other category would be like, they would be like a medic, or they would be a clerk somewhere where they would be in a non-combatant role in the service.
A lot of men went to Canada at that time. Did they decide to go to Canada if the Selective Service Board said to them, you're going to have to go into the military?
I can't answer that question because it was the only thing. I would say there was a facility or a branch, and I'm not sure who it was, that actually would try to track these people down. Of course, the idea of going to Canada, then you'd be outside of the jurisdiction of the United States government. That was the idea of going to Canada. But actually, if someone was high on the draft list and they decided to, let's say, bug out, they would attempt to find them, and they could be arrested if they'd actually gotten orders, to report for service, for duty, and then they didn't obey the orders. And they would actually send some sort of, what it was, a federal marshal, or they would actually send someone out to arrest them. And they would then stand trial as a draft evader and could be sent to prison.
That was a tough time.
Yeah.
Earlier you were talking about your father going to Carson City and getting the rights for the water, getting the water district. Tell me about some of your father's other business friends and the kind of businesses they owned.
Well, there was
Or your friends.
well, this is both. There was the first really department store in Las Vegas was called Ronzoni's. And when we lived on 4th Street, we lived next door to the Ronzoni's. They had a nice home. We were living in a little duplex, so we met them early on when we first came to Las Vegas. And they had started, I may be getting a little bit off the track, but anyway, they started in one of the little mining towns, I think Tonopah. It was the first place they had a store, the Ronzoni family. Then they came to Las Vegas, as Las Vegas, they knew, was beginning to grow. And I think they came here a little bit after my father, but not in the 30s. They came here and started a little store downtown on Fremont Street, and then they prospered and they built a bigger store. And they were really the first, I'd call, department store in Las Vegas. And we were very familiar with the Ronzoni family. There was you ask about the White Cross Drug. That was run by Mr. Farron, and Bill Farron was his name, and he was a friend of my father's, and I mentioned the proximity of the White Cross Drug. There was also the first Western store to sell Western clothing and Indian jewelry was called Smith & Chandler. It was on Fremont Street. Most of the businesses, the early businesses, were on Fremont Street, or if they, like my father's business, were about a half a block off from Fremont. But Smith & Chandler, those were two gentlemen, that was their name, and then they had the Western and Indian store, and they also ran, during the summer months, they had a similar store actually near Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. And they actually always had at least one Indian jeweler working in the store, actually making Indian jewelry right there in the store, which was, really kind of unique and something that was different. And my dad knew both those two gentlemen. the Apache Hotel, which was on. Yeah, I'm not sure how you spell that. If you want, I think it's maybe S-I-L, and I think there's a G in there, and maybe a G-A-N-I. But anyway, they had the Apache Hotel, which was, I believe, 3 stories high, and it was only probably about 75 feet in both directions, 75 feet frontage on Fremont and 75 feet going down north on 2nd Street. So he knew that family. Then there was a...
Would you pronounce the name of that family again?
I think it's called, you don't pronounce the G, I think it's Sylvani. Then there was the Von Tobel family that had the lumber company on South 1st Street, and the senior Mr. Von Tobel came here the very day, 1905, that they auctioned off the lots and bought that property. Then he had sons that carried it on, 3 sons. So they were there on South 1st Street. There was another family that were pioneers that came here, I think, perhaps the very first day also, and their name is Beckley. It's Beckley, and they had a building on the corner of First and Fremont, and downstairs they had a men's clothing store. I'm sure it was the first one in Las Vegas. And then upstairs were offices that they rented out to, like maybe a lawyer or a dentist or something like that.
And the name of the store was their last name?
Yes, Beckley Brothers. There were 2 brothers. Don't remember their first names, but so he was friendly with those gentlemen. I'm trying to think. There was Bartlett Hardware. They had a store on Fremont Street, a hardware store, a couple of different locations. And they didn't have 2 stores, but they moved. Mr. Cragen, who later on, Ernie Cragen, was the owner of the Elf Hotel Theater. So my dad was friendly with Mr. Cragen. That's C-R-A-G-I-N. And he later on was the mayor of Las Vegas for quite a number of years. Another mayor that came along later, quite a bit later, but he was here in Vegas, I think more, he probably came, I think, in maybe the 40s, and that was Orrin Gregson. And he started out with an automobile repair shop, then went into the furniture business, and then went into somewhat a similar business to us, but he had both furniture and appliances, which he became one of our friendly competitors.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you were saying when you were talking about the locations of your business, at one point you moved to Charleston, and I think I interrupted you. Tell me about that move. That was the 3rd location?
Fourth location. In 1961, we moved to East Charleston, near Bruce Street, not exactly, but 1700 block on East Charleston. That was the last location where we were from.
Okay, now prior to that location, you were where?
Okay, we were on South 2nd Street at 116, just right next door to the Golden Nugget. There was one little tiny parking lot between us and the Golden Nugget. And and there was Western Union was right across the street from us. And in the 30s and up in the 40s, there was a bowling alley also on the other side of the street. Las Vegas's, I'm sure it must have been Las Vegas's first bowling alley. But anyway, we moved from before that, we were on the corner of 2nd and Carson. We occupied just part of a building. It was a fairly large building, but in the other part of the building was a grocery store called the Market Spot. And it was run by an old-time family that were involved in politics later on. The name was Levy, L-E-V-Y. I can't think of the first name now, but and so that's where we were, in just an end of a grocery store.
Okay.
And of course, the first location I mentioned was on Fremont, between 5th and 6th on Fremont. It was tiny too, very small.
Okay, good. Las Vegas didn't engage in school segregation except for the first 3 grades. So why did the city as a whole become such separate worlds for black and whites?
I don't know. I think maybe, and this is maybe not the right answer, but I'll give you an answer.
Good.
The people that came here, the black people that came here in the 40s, were used to segregation. And I think that had something to do with it. They came from the deep south, and as I say, I think they, in a sense, they wanted to be segregated. That's what they were accustomed to.
And another thing, that migration in the 40s, did you also see a migration in of a lot of whites at the same time?
Yes, of course, yes. The town grew a lot in the 40s, not only because of basic magnesium plant, but also because of the military activity. It wasn't called Nellis in those days. It was Las Vegas Army Airfield. But the town grew during World War II. Oh, absolutely. Positively. It probably, between 1940 and 1945, I'm sure it at least doubled in size. Maybe more than doubled.
And the last question that I had from my review of the other tapes, you told me about your daughters, but you didn't give me names.
Okay. Well, we have Rebecca, but Rebecca was born while I was still in the Army, Fort Sill. I think I mentioned that. At Fort Sill. And then Susie was born in Flagstaff. And they're just 2 years apart. But I was out of the service when Susie was born. That's Suzanne, to be correct.
Okay, good. And I think those were the questions that I had from the last tapes and what I wanted to ask you today as well. Since the last interview, did you think of other things that you would want to have us remember about Las Vegas, have us know about early Las Vegas?
Well, I think I might have mentioned it, but I'd kind of maybe emphasize it, is that during the 30s and even in the 40s, I mentioned it began to grow and rapidly, but it was still a pretty small place. And what I mean, that it's a small town. In the 30s, I think maybe only maybe 5,000 people. In the 40s, I think it finally got up, to maybe 20,000 in the 40s. But you knew a lot of people, and especially with my father being in business and customers coming in, he knew, lots and lots of people that way, and because of his being active in the Chamber of Commerce and it was like I grew up in what I'd call a kind of a small town atmosphere. and very different than what Las Vegas, even in the 50s, after it began to grow some more, it began to change. And you mentioned being a tourist town, and I really, I'll give you the same answer I gave you the other day, that I really, in the 50s, it began to be a tourist town. So that's, I think, about the only point I would like to emphasize.
Okay. Your father had a business partner during part of his business career, and the person's name was Goodfellow?
Yes, Les Goodfellow.
Could you tell me a little about the Goodfellow family?
Yeah, I can tell you as much as I know. He was working in this small appliance store when my dad came down from Reno, so the two of them formed a partnership. He lived on Fremont Street in a very modest home along roughly like maybe around 8th or 9th in Fremont. He unfortunately passed on very suddenly along, trying to think, I'd say probably about 1939 or 1940. He was basically about the same age as my father. And so shortly after he passed on, my father bought his interest out. He paid the widow, and I can't think of her first name, but anyway, he, let's say, bought her out. And then my dad was the sole owner of Luce and Goodfellow. However, he didn't want to change the name, and he never did change the name. Mrs. Goodfellow, at that same location that I'm speaking about, I'd say maybe up into the 50s, built a very small hotel there. I mean, I'm talking about a hotel that maybe only had like maybe 10 rooms or something like that. And so that was her, let's say, her business. Mrs. Goodfellow ran this hotel. I can't think what she called it.
But now, which location was it?
This would have been like about 8th and Fremont Street on a corner.
Mm-hmm.
And she lived for quite a few years, but she never, of course, had any interest in the business after she sold out. And so I don't think, in my whole life, I probably only talked to her maybe twice. And so that's about all I can tell you.
That's good. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I think that is my last question.
Okay.
And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate the information that you shared with us.
Okay. Let me ask you, you want to turn the machine off, you can, but it's not as a secret. I was just curious as to if you give me some kind of a concept of how many other people like myself that you're going to be talking to.
We are going to, right now we have several lists.
I see.
Mrs. Boyer gave us a list. A couple of other people who are on our various boards here at the university have given us several lists. And we are just working as many people as we can, as rapidly as we can. Because you're younger, but we have some people who are many years...
80, 90, and 100 years old.
Many years older, and we're just trying to get to as many of them as we possibly can. We're thinking that by the end of the project, we'll probably have about 40 to 50 interviews. And we haven't decided yet how we're going to display them. But I'm turning off the tape now because I want to show you one of the books that we've done for another project.